I never imagined that buying waterfront property in Michigan would lead to a war with a woman who believed she owned not just her neighborhood, but apparently my entire island too. The whole mess started on a humid Tuesday morning in July when I was sitting on my dock, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint Lake Huron in shades of orange and pink. My name is Theodore Fitzgerald, and I had purchased this incredible piece of property 6 months earlier. The deal included a modest 2-story house on the mainland in the Pleasant Shores community, plus exclusive ownership of a small private island about 300 yards offshore. The island was maybe 2 acres total, covered in old-growth trees, with a tiny cabin my grandfather had built back in the 70s. He had passed it down to my father, who sold it when he retired to Florida. When it came back on the market, I jumped at the chance to reclaim a piece of family history. The Pleasant Shores Homeowners Association had seemed reasonable enough during the buying process. Standard rules about lawn maintenance, noise ordinances, architectural approval for major renovations. Nothing I couldn't live with. The monthly dues were a bit steep at $250, but the community maintained the private boat launch, the shoreline park, and kept the streets in good condition. I had just taken my first sip of coffee when I heard the sound of a boat motor cutting through the morning silence. I glanced up to see a pontoon boat heading straight for my dock. As it got closer, I could make out 3 people aboard, 2 women and 1 man, all probably in their late 40s or early 50s. The woman at the helm had that distinctive haircut, the one that screams, "I want to speak to your manager" from 100 yards away. Blonde, short, aggressively styled. She was wearing a visor and oversized sunglasses despite the early hour. The pontoon bumped against my dock with more force than necessary. I stood up, setting my coffee down on the weathered wood. "Can I help you folks?" I called out. The blonde woman killed the engine and stood up, clipboard in hand. Of course she had a clipboard. "Theodore Fitzgerald?" she asked, though her tone suggested it was more of an accusation than a question. "That's me, and you are?" "I'm Patricia Whitmore, president of the Pleasant Shores Homeowners Association. This is Sandra Chen, our treasurer, and Mark Williams, our compliance officer." She gestured to her companions, who both nodded but remained seated. "We need to discuss your island." I felt my jaw tighten. My island. "What about it?" Patricia stepped onto my dock without invitation, her white deck shoes making sharp sounds against the wood. "That's actually what we're here to discuss. Your so-called ownership of Willow Island." Willow Island. I had never heard anyone call it that. "That's what the community has called it for decades," Sandra piped up from the boat. She was a smaller woman with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. "It's been a community recreation area since Pleasant Shores was established." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of the situation was already apparent. Recreation area. I own that island. I have the deed, the title, everything. It was part of my property purchase. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Fitzgerald, I think there's been some confusion. When Pleasant Shores was incorporated in 1998, all waterfront amenities within the community boundaries were designated as common areas for resident use. That includes Willow Island. First of all, my family owned that island and the cabin on it since 1972, way before your HOA existed. Second, I just bought this property 6 months ago. The island was explicitly listed in the sale. Third, I've been going out there every weekend since I moved in, and nobody said a word until right now." Mark finally spoke up, his voice nasally and officious. "We only recently became aware that you were treating the island as private property. Several residents have complained that you've been turning people away. Because it is private property, My voice was rising now. Last weekend, I went over to the cabin and found a group of teenagers having a party. Beer cans everywhere, they'd broken a window, completely trashed the place. When I told them to leave, they said the HOA told them they could use the island. Patricia's expression didn't change. The island has always been open to community members. That's been the understanding for nearly 30 years. Understanding. I picked up my coffee cup, realized my hand was shaking with frustration, and set it back down. I don't care what the understanding was. I have a legal deed that says I own that island. You can't just declare someone's private property a public space because you feel like it. Sandra stood up in the boat now, her own clipboard appearing. We've reviewed the community bylaws extensively. Any property within the Pleasant Shores boundaries falls under HOA jurisdiction. The island is within our boundaries. Show me, I demanded. Show me in the bylaws where it says the HOA can claim ownership of property that was privately owned before the HOA even existed. Patricia smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. We're not claiming ownership. We're simply enforcing community access rights. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing. Mr. Fitzgerald, Patricia's voice took on a condescending tone that made my teeth ache. I understand you're new to the community. Perhaps you don't understand how things work here. Pleasant Shores is a cooperative neighborhood. We share resources. We work together. Your refusal to allow community members access to Willow Island is creating division and disharmony. It's creating disharmony that I won't let strangers trash my property. Our position is that it's not your property, not in the way you think. Patricia pulled a document from her clipboard and held it out to me. This is a formal notice from the HOA board. You have 30 days to remove any barriers preventing community access to the island, including any no trespassing signs you may have posted. You're also required to maintain the island in accordance with community standards, which includes regular trash removal and upkeep of the walking paths. I took the document, scanning it quickly. It was everything she had just said, printed on official HOA letterhead with the signatures of all 5 board members at the bottom. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to pursue legal action, Mark said, finally standing up as well. The HOA has the authority to place liens on properties for non-compliance. We can also levy daily fines until the issue is resolved. You've got to be kidding me. Patricia's expression was smugly satisfied. We're completely serious. The HOA exists to maintain property values and community standards. Your selfish behavior is detrimental to both. We expect full compliance within 30 days. With that, she stepped back into the pontoon boat. Mark started the engine, and they pulled away from my dock, leaving me standing there with the ridiculous notice in my hand and my coffee getting cold. I spent the rest of that day fuming. By evening, I had calmed down enough to start thinking logically. I pulled out all my property documents, the title, the deed, the survey, everything from the closing. There it was in black and white. Property includes mainland parcel 45,332.18 and island parcel 45,332.19, commonly known as Fitzgerald Island. My grandfather had named it after our family when he bought it in 1972. The survey map clearly showed the island's boundaries and confirmed it was part of my legal property. The title was clean. No easements, no shared access rights, nothing that would give the HOA any claim to it. I called my real estate attorney the next morning. His name was Gary Stevens, a semi-retired lawyer who had handled my property purchase. He listened to my story with increasing disbelief. They said, "What now?" Gary's voice crackled through my phone. That the island is community property because it's within HOA boundaries, and I have to allow public access. That's ridiculous. You have clear title. The island isn't mentioned anywhere in the HOA bylaws as common property. I reviewed those bylaws myself during your purchase. That's what I thought, but they're threatening liens and fines. Gary sighed. Theodore, I'm going to be honest with you. Fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming, even when they're completely in the wrong, which they are, to be clear. But they have resources, they have lawyers on retainer, and they can make your life miserable in the meantime. So what do I do? Well, you have two options. One, you can comply with their ridiculous demands and sue them later for the loss of use of your property. Two, you can fight them now, which means lawyer fees and probably a lawsuit. There has to be something else, some way to shut this down before it becomes a whole thing. You could try showing up at their next board meeting with your documentation. Present your case directly. Sometimes these local tyrants back down when confronted with actual evidence. But honestly, people like this Patricia woman, they don't care about evidence. They care about control. I thanked Gary and hung up, feeling even more frustrated than before. I spent the next few days doing research. I learned that HOA disputes were depressingly common, and that homeowners lost far more often than they won, even when they were legally in the right. The HOAs had money, organization, and time. Individual homeowners usually gave up before the battle was over. But the more I read, the more determined I became. This wasn't just about the island anymore. It was about principle. Patricia Whitmore and her board thought they could bully me into surrendering my legal property rights just because they said so. I wasn't going to let that happen. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 in the evening. It was held in the community center, a modern building near the boat launch that probably cost a fortune to build with everyone's dues money. I arrived 15 minutes early with a folder full of documents. My deed, my title, my survey maps, historical records I had found about the island's ownership going back decades. The meeting room was already half full. I recognized a few neighbors, though I didn't know most of them by name yet. I had kept to myself since moving in, spending most of my free time fixing up the cabin on the island. Now, I was regretting not being more social. These people were going to vote on what happened to my property, and I was a stranger to most of them. Patricia swept in at exactly 7, followed by her board members. Sandra was there along with Mark, and 2 others I hadn't met. A heavy-set man named Robert Hayes who served as secretary, and a thin woman named Jennifer Morrison who was the vice president. They took their seats at a table at the front of the room, Patricia in the center like a queen holding court. This meeting of the Pleasant Shores Homeowners Association is now called to order, Patricia announced, banging a gavel against the table. First order of business, approval of last month's minutes. The meeting dragged through standard business. Budget reports, approval of landscaping contracts, discussion about whether the pool hours should be extended on weekends. I sat through it all, my folder clutched in my hands, waiting for my chance. Finally, Patricia cleared her throat. New business. We have an issue regarding Willow Island that needs to be addressed. Here we go. As many of you know, we have a new resident who has been preventing community members from accessing the island. This is unacceptable and contrary to the established traditions of our community. The board has issued a compliance notice, but I wanted to bring this before the full membership to ensure everyone understands the situation. Hands shot up around the room. Patricia pointed to an older man in the front row. I've been coming to Pleasant Shores for 20 years, he said. My grandkids love playing on that island. It's always been a community space. Who does this guy think he is, trying to kick people out? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I felt my face getting hot. Patricia nodded sympathetically. That's exactly the kind of impact this is having on our community. Does anyone else have thoughts? A woman in her 30s raised her hand. I took my daughter over there last week for a picnic, and this man came out of the cabin and told us to leave. He was really rude about it. That wasn't even close to what had happened. I had found her and her daughter in the cabin, going through my things, and I had politely asked them to leave the private property. But I wasn't rude. That's not true, I said loudly, standing up. I asked you to leave because you were inside my cabin without permission. Every head turned to look at me. Patricia's smile was victorious. Mr. Fitzgerald, thank you for joining us. Would you like to address the board? I walked to the front of the room, my folder feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. Yes, I would. I've been listening to everyone talk about the island like it's community property, but that's not legally accurate. I own that island. I have the deed right here. I pulled out the documents and held them up. This is the legal deed to my property. It clearly includes the island. My family has owned it since 1972, long before this HOA existed. The title is clean. There are no easements or access rights granted to anyone. It's private property, and it's been private property for over 50 years. Patricia's expression didn't change. Mr. Fitzgerald, nobody is disputing that you have some paperwork. What we're saying is that there's a long-standing community tradition that supersedes any technical ownership claims. Tradition doesn't supersede legal ownership. That's not how property law works. In this community it does. Jennifer Morrison spoke up, her voice sharp. We have rules here. Rules that exist to benefit everyone, not just one selfish individual. Rules that you can't just make up. Show me in the HOA bylaws where it says you can claim private property as a common area. Mark stood up, his own folder in hand. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Community Bylaws. All waterfront areas within Pleasant Shores boundaries shall be maintained for the reasonable enjoyment of all residents. That's about maintaining shorelines, not claiming ownership of private islands. The island is within our boundaries. But it's not owned by the HOA. It's owned by me. You can't have jurisdiction over property you don't own just because it's geographically nearby. The argument went back and forth for another 20 minutes. Other residents joined in, most of them supporting the HOA, a few brave souls suggesting that maybe I had a point about legal ownership. Patricia eventually gavelled the discussion to a close. The board's position stands, she announced. Mr. Fitzgerald has 30 days to comply with our notice, or we will begin enforcement procedures. This matter is closed. This matter isn't closed, I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. If you try to put a lien on my property or fine me for protecting my legal rights, I'll sue this HOA into oblivion. Patricia's eyes flashed with anger. Threats are not appropriate at board meetings, Mr. Fitzgerald. I think you should leave. I'm a member of this community. I have as much right to be here as anyone. Security, Patricia called out, and I turned to see a uniformed guard standing by the door. I hadn't even noticed him when I came in. You have got to be kidding me. Please escort Mr. Fitzgerald from the premises, Patricia said calmly. He's becoming disruptive. The guard approached me reluctantly. He was a young guy, probably early 20s, and looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation. Sir, I need to ask you to leave, he said quietly. I looked around the room at all the faces staring at me. Some looked sympathetic, but most seemed hostile. These people really believed the island belonged to them, that I was the villain for trying to keep my own property. Fine, I said, gathering my documents. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. I walked out with as much dignity as I could muster, the guard trailing behind me. Outside in the parking lot, I sat in my truck for a long moment, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking again, this time with anger rather than frustration. I drove home and poured myself a whiskey, something I rarely did on weeknights. Then I called Gary Stevens again, even though it was late. "I need to sue the HOA," I told him when he answered. "Tonight convinced me. They're not going to back down, and I'm not giving up my island." Gary was quiet for a moment. "You're sure? Because once we start down this road, it's going to get ugly. It's already ugly. At least if we sue, maybe we can end it." "All right. Come by my office tomorrow and we'll start drafting a complaint, but Theodore, I need you to be prepared. This could take months or even years, and it's going to cost you." "I know." The next morning, I went to Gary's office in Bay City, about 40 minutes from Pleasant Shores. His office was in an old converted house near the river, the kind of place that smelled like old books and furniture polish. We spent 3 hours going through everything, building the case. "Here's what we're going to argue," Gary said, leaning back in his chair. 1. You have clear legal title to the island. 2. The HOA has no legal basis to claim community access rights. 3. Their threats of liens and fines constitute harassment and interference with your property rights. We'll ask for a declaratory judgment confirming your ownership, an injunction preventing the HOA from taking any action against you, and damages for your legal fees and emotional distress. What are my chances? On the merits, I'd say 95% in your favor. You clearly own the island, but HOA cases are unpredictable. Judges sometimes defer to community bylaws even when they shouldn't, and the HOA will drag this out, file motions, try to exhaust you financially. Then we better get started. Gary filed the lawsuit the following week. I had the satisfaction of knowing that Patricia and her board were being served with legal papers, but that satisfaction was short-lived. Within days, I started receiving violation notices from the HOA. My grass was apparently a quarter-inch too long. My house numbers weren't properly illuminated. My garbage cans were visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection day. Each violation came with a $50 fine. I took photos documenting that none of the violations were real. My grass was fine, my house numbers had working lights, my garbage cans were in my garage. But the fines kept coming, and according to the HOA bylaws, I had to pay them pending appeal or they could place a lien on my property. I stopped paying after the first week. Let them try to lien my property. It would just be more evidence of harassment for the lawsuit. The situation escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Someone spray-painted "Island Thief" on my driveway in the middle of the night. I filed a police report, but the sheriff's deputy who responded didn't seem particularly interested in investigating. "Probably just kids," he said, making notes on his pad that I suspected he'd never look at again. "Kids who happen to know about my property dispute with the HOA." The deputy shrugged. "You might want to consider compromising with your neighbors. HOA disputes tend to get nasty when people dig in their heels." "I'm not digging in my heels. I'm protecting my legal property rights. If you say so." "I'll file this report, but I wouldn't expect much to come of it." The vandalism continued. Someone slashed my tires. Someone else threw eggs at my house. I installed security cameras which caught a group of 3 people in hoodies, faces covered, tearing up my flower beds at 2 in the morning. I gave the footage to the police, but again, nothing came of it. The worst part was the social isolation. Neighbors who had previously waved politely now glared at me or turned away. Someone started a Facebook group called Save Willow Island that portrayed me as a greedy outsider trying to steal community property. They posted old photos of families on the island, kids playing on the beach, couples having picnics under the trees. I tried to comment, to explain my side, but I was immediately blocked. The narrative was set. I was the bad guy. 3 weeks into this nightmare, I went out to the island to check on the cabin. What I found made my blood boil. Someone had broken in again, and this time they had done serious damage. Furniture was smashed, the windows were all broken, and someone had spray-painted community property across every wall. I called the police again, and this time a different deputy came out. Her name was Officer Rachel Morrison, no relation to the Jennifer on the HOA board, and she actually seemed to take the situation seriously. "This is breaking and entering, destruction of property," she said, photographing the damage. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" "I have a pretty good idea it's related to my dispute with the HOA, but I can't prove anything. The HOA is the one claiming this island should be public access." "Yeah." Officer Morrison frowned, looking around at the destruction. "That doesn't give anyone the right to do this. I'm going to file a full report and recommend that the detective division follows up. We've actually gotten a few complaints lately about escalating tensions in Pleasant Shores. This might be part of a pattern." That was at least slightly encouraging. I spent the rest of the day boarding up the broken windows and documenting the damage for both the police and my lawsuit. Gary called me that evening. "I heard about the cabin. This is actually good for our case." "Good. My family's cabin is destroyed." "I know, and I'm sorry. But it shows a pattern of harassment directly connected to the HOA's actions. Their public statements about the island being community property are inciting this kind of behavior. We can argue they're liable for the damages. Can we add that to the lawsuit? Already drafting an amended complaint." The HOA's response to my lawsuit arrived a week later. It was a thick document, at least 30 pages, filed by a law firm from Detroit that specialized in HOA cases. I read through it with growing disbelief. They were arguing that the island had been abandoned property when the HOA was formed, and that the community had acquired it through adverse possession. They claimed that residents had been using the island openly and continuously since 1998, which meant they now had legal ownership regardless of what my deed said. "This is insane," I told Gary over the phone. "Adverse possession requires the property owner to not contest the use. My family owned it the whole time. My father visited regularly until he sold it. It was never abandoned." "I know. Their argument is weak, but it's creative. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. We'll file our response next week." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for September, still months away. In the meantime, life in Pleasant Shores became increasingly unbearable. The HOA passed a new rule requiring all boats to register with the association before using the community boat launch. My registration was denied, supposedly because my dues were delinquent due to unpaid fines. I had to launch my boat at a public ramp 3 miles away, adding almost an hour to any trip to my island. It was petty and obvious retaliation, but there was nothing I could do about it in the short term. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was a Saturday in late August, and I was on the island trying to repair some of the damage from the break-in. I had just replaced one of the broken windows when I heard voices. A lot of voices. I walked out of the cabin to find at least 50 people gathered on the island's small beach. They had kayaks, canoes, even a few small motorboats pulled up on the sand. Someone had brought a portable speaker that was blasting music. People were setting up beach chairs and coolers. Patricia Whitmore was there, wearing a sun hat and a satisfied smile. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, walking down to the beach. Community Beach Day, Patricia announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Since this is community property, we're exercising our right to use it. This is private property and you're all trespassing. I want everyone off this island right now. Or what? Patricia challenged. You'll call the police. We're not breaking any laws. This is a peaceful gathering on public land. It's not public land. A man I recognized from the HOA meeting stepped forward. You don't own this island just because some piece of paper says you do. We've been using this island for decades. Our families have memories here. You can't just show up and take that away from us. I didn't take anything away. I bought property that belonged to my grandfather. This was never public land. But I was shouting into the wind. Nobody was listening. They were unpacking their coolers, spreading out their blankets, settling in like they had every right to be there. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office. It took 45 minutes for a deputy to arrive, and by that time, the party was in full swing. Kids were swimming, adults were grilling hot dogs, and someone had even brought a volleyball net. The deputy was the same one who had responded to my first vandalism report, the one who hadn't seemed interested. He surveyed the scene with obvious annoyance. You called about trespassers? Yes. All these people are on my private property. I've asked them to leave and they've refused. The deputy sighed. Mr. Fitzgerald, I'm aware of your situation with the HOA. This looks like a civil dispute to me, not a criminal matter. They're trespassing. That's a crime. Only if the property ownership is clear, and according to the HOA, it's not. According to my deed, it is. Like I said, civil dispute. You need to work this out in court. So you're not going to do anything. I can't arrest 50 people for trespassing when there's a legitimate question about who owns the property. My advice is to leave and let your lawyers handle it. He walked away, leaving me standing there feeling completely helpless. Patricia was watching the whole exchange with that same satisfied smile. I left the island, not because I wanted to, but because I knew if I stayed, I'd lose my temper and do something stupid. Back at my house, I called Gary immediately. They're having a party on my island right now, at least 50 people. The police won't do anything. Because it's a civil matter. I know it's frustrating, but this actually works in our favor. The HOA is openly encouraging people to trespass on your property. It's exactly the kind of aggressive behavior we need to show the judge. I don't care about showing the judge. I want them off my island. And that's what we're working toward. Did you get photos or video? I hadn't thought of that. I grabbed my camera and drove to a point on the shoreline where I could see the island. Through the telephoto lens, I captured dozens of images of the gathering. Patricia was visible in several of them, clearly leading the event. The beach party became a weekly occurrence. Every Saturday, the same group would descend on my island, sometimes even larger. They started leaving trash behind, destroying the natural vegetation, carving initials into trees. My island was turning into a disaster zone, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Then I remembered something my father had mentioned years ago, something I hadn't thought about in decades. My grandfather had shown him old documents about the island's history, papers that dated back to when Michigan was still a territory. My father had been fascinated by the history, but I had been just a kid and hadn't paid much attention. I called my father in Florida. Dad, do you remember Grandpa showing us those old papers about the island? Sure, the historical documents. Why? You know what happened to them? I think they're in storage. When I sold the property, I kept all of Grandpa's personal effects. I have a unit in Clearwater with boxes of his stuff. Why are you asking? I explained the situation with the HOA. My father was shocked and angry. They can't do that. That island has been in our family since before there was electricity out there. That's what I'm trying to prove. Those historical documents might help. Is there any way you could look through the storage unit? I'll go tomorrow. But Theodore, it's been years since I looked at that stuff. I don't even know if I kept those particular papers. Anything you can find would help. My father called me back 2 days later. I found them. There's a whole box of documents about the island. Some of this stuff goes back to the 1890s. My heart started pounding. The 1890s. Yeah. Apparently, our family connection to that island goes back a lot further than I realized. Grandpa's grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, purchased the island in 1892 from a lumber company. It's all documented. Can you send me copies? I'll do better than that. I'm flying up this weekend. This HOA needs to see that they're messing with the wrong family. My father arrived on Friday evening, carrying a weathered cardboard box that smelled like old paper and time. We spread the contents across my kitchen table, careful with the fragile documents. There it was, near the bottom of the box, a deed dated June 15, 1892. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was still legible. My great-great-grandfather, James Fitzgerald, had purchased the island from Northern Lumber Company for the sum of $75. The deed described the property in the archaic language of the time, but there was no mistaking what it was. The same island, identified by its geographic coordinates and its position relative to the shoreline. The document bore official seals from the state of Michigan and signatures from witnesses. But there was more. Tucked behind the deed were survey maps from 1892, correspondence with the lumber company, tax records dating back over a century. A complete chain of ownership from 1892 to the present day, all keeping the island in the Fitzgerald family. This is incredible, I breathed, holding up the original deed. Your great-great-grandfather was a shipbuilder, my father said, pointing to some of the correspondence. He bought the island as a source of timber for his business. Eventually, he built a small workshop out there. That's where the original cabin was, though it's been rebuilt several times since. Does this prove anything legally? It proves the island has been continuously owned by our family since 1892. There's no gap in ownership, no abandonment, no period where it could have become community property. This demolishes their adverse possession argument. I called Gary immediately, even though it was late. I found something. Historical documents proving my family's ownership going back to 1892. Gary was suddenly very awake. Are you serious? Completely. Original deeds, survey maps, tax records, the whole chain of ownership. My father's here and we have all the documents. Don't touch anything else. I'm coming over right now. If these documents are what you say they are, this case just became a slam dunk. Gary arrived within an hour, still wearing slippers and a bathrobe under his coat. He spent 2 hours examining the documents, taking photos, making notes. His excitement grew with each page he reviewed. This is remarkable, he kept saying. I've never seen such a complete historical record of property ownership. Theodore, this doesn't just prove you own the island. It proves the island has been private property since before Michigan was even a state. So what do we do with it? We file an emergency motion for a preliminary injunction. With this evidence, we can get a court order stopping the HOA from allowing people onto your island while the lawsuit is pending. Then we'll use these documents to destroy their case at trial. The motion was filed on Monday morning. Gary had worked through the weekend, drafting a comprehensive brief that laid out the entire history of the island's ownership. We included photographs of the original 1892 deed, the survey maps, and key documents from every decade since. The hearing was scheduled for that Friday, incredibly fast by court standards. The judge, a woman named Sarah Martinez, had apparently taken an interest in the case. I arrived at the courthouse in Bay City with Gary and my father. The HOA was represented by their fancy Detroit lawyers, 3 of them in expensive suits. Patricia was there too, sitting in the gallery with Sandra and Mark, all of them looking confident. That confidence evaporated when Gary began presenting our evidence. "Your Honor," Gary said, approaching the bench with a folder of documents, "we have historical records proving that the island in question has been continuously owned by the Fitzgerald family since June 15, 1892. This is the original deed." He carefully removed the preserved document and handed it to Judge Martinez. She examined it closely, her eyebrows rising. "This appears to be authentic," she said. "I'm seeing official state seals and signatures from territorial officials. It is authentic, Your Honor. We also have survey maps from 1892, tax records showing continuous payment of property taxes by the Fitzgerald family, and documentation of improvements made to the property over the past 130 years. This island has never been abandoned, never been public land, and never been community property." The HOA's claim is entirely without merit. The HOA's lead attorney, a slick man named Richard Cranston, stood up. "Your Honor, the age of the deed doesn't change the fact that the community has been using the island for decades. Adverse possession can overcome even ancient ownership claims." "Not when the owners have been continuously paying taxes and maintaining the property," Gary shot back. "Which our records clearly show. There is no basis for an adverse possession claim, and the defendant knows it." Judge Martinez studied the documents for a long moment. "Mr. Cranston, does the HOA have any documentation showing a legal right to access this island? We have testimony from community members who have used the island since the HOA was founded." "That's not documentation. That's just people using someone else's property without permission." "Do you have any deed, any easement, any legal document whatsoever giving the HOA rights to this land?" Cranston hesitated. "No, Your Honor, but community tradition is not a substitute for legal ownership. Mr. Stevens, I'm granting your motion for a preliminary injunction. The HOA and its members are hereby ordered to cease all access to the island pending resolution of this case. Any violation of this order will result in contempt charges." Patricia made a sound from the gallery, something between a gasp and a cry of outrage. Judge Martinez's eyes snapped to her. "Is there something you'd like to say, madam?" Patricia stood up, ignoring her lawyer's attempts to pull her back down. "This is wrong. That island belongs to everyone. His family can't just claim ownership because they have some old piece of paper. That old piece of paper is a legal deed registered with the state of Michigan. And yes, his family absolutely can claim ownership based on it. That's how property rights work. If you continue to violate Mr. Fitzgerald's property rights after this injunction is issued, I will hold you personally in contempt of court. Do you understand?" Patricia's face had gone red, but she sat down without another word. Judge Martinez turned back to the lawyers. "I'm also ordering the HOA to remove any fines or liens they've placed on Mr. Fitzgerald's property in connection with this dispute. This case is going to trial, but based on what I've seen today, I'll tell you right now, the plaintiff has an exceptionally strong case. I'd advise the HOA to consider settling." We left the courthouse in a state of euphoria. My father clapped me on the shoulder. "Your great-great-grandfather would be proud." "We haven't won yet," Gary cautioned, but he was grinning. "But that injunction is huge. They can't touch your island now." The injunction was served on the HOA that same day. I posted copies of it on the island at the boat launch and on my dock. The message was clear. Stay off my property or face contempt charges. For about a week, things were quiet. The Saturday beach parties stopped. Nobody approached my island. I spent my time cleaning up the damage and beginning repairs on the cabin. Then the harassment started again, but this time it was different, more aggressive, more personal. Someone broke into my house while I was at work and vandalized it, spray painting obscenities on the walls. My car was keyed so badly that every panel needed to be repainted. Someone even tried to run me off the road one night as I was driving home. I reported everything to the police, and this time, Officer Morrison took it very seriously. "This has escalated beyond a property dispute," she said, looking at photos of the damage to my house. "This is criminal harassment, possibly even stalking. I'm recommending we open a full investigation." "You think it's the HOA? I think it's people who support the HOA's position. Whether the HOA board members are directly involved, I don't know yet, but we're going to find out." The investigation moved slowly, but Morrison kept me updated. They were reviewing security footage from neighbors' cameras, looking for patterns, trying to identify the people in hoodies who kept vandalizing my property. Meanwhile, the lawsuit moved forward. The HOA refused to settle, despite the judge's suggestion. They filed motion after motion, each one attempting to delay or derail the case. Gary batted them all down and we got a trial date, December 15th. In November, things came to a head. I was on the island on a Sunday afternoon, working on the cabin's roof, when I heard a boat approaching. I climbed down the ladder to find Patricia pulling up to the shore in a small fishing boat. She was alone. "You're violating the court order," I called out before she even got out of the boat. Patricia killed the engine and stood up, but she didn't get out. "I'm not here to use the island. I'm here to talk to you. Talk to my lawyer, please. Just give me 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I walked down to the shoreline. I didn't invite her onto the island and she didn't try to land the boat. "What do you want?" Patricia looked different than she had in court. Older, tired. "I want you to understand why this matters so much to us." "I understand perfectly. You want something that doesn't belong to you. It's not that simple. When Pleasant Shores was founded, we were a small community of people who wanted something better than what we had. We built this neighborhood from nothing. The island was abandoned then, overgrown, unusable. We cleaned it up, made it beautiful, created a place where families could make memories. It wasn't abandoned. My father still owned it, but he never came here. For years, nobody used it. We thought it was just empty land. That doesn't give you the right to claim it." Patricia's voice rose in frustration. "Don't you see what you're doing? You're destroying our community. People have been fighting with each other, taking sides. Friendships are ending. All because you won't share one small island. I'm not destroying anything. I'm protecting what's mine. Your community's problems aren't my responsibility, but they could be. If you just agreed to some kind of limited access, scheduled times when the community could use the island, we could end all of this. So you can have beach parties and leave trash everywhere. So teenagers can break into my cabin and destroy it. We'd set rules. We'd maintain it properly. It could work." I looked at this woman who had made my life hell for months. She actually seemed to believe she was being reasonable. "No," I said simply. "This is my property, my family's property. It's been ours for 130 years. You don't get to take it just because you want it. And frankly, after everything you and your board have done, I wouldn't let you on this island if you paid me." Patricia's face hardened. "You're going to regret this." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise. You think you've won because you have some old deed. There are other ways to make your life difficult. You still live in Pleasant Shores. You still have to follow our rules. Not if those rules are designed to harass me. The judge already made you remove the fines. We'll find other ways, legal ways. You'll be fighting us for years." She started her engine and motored away, leaving me standing on the shore feeling uneasy. There was something in her voice, a determined vindictiveness that worried me. I called Officer Morrison and told her about the encounter. She basically threatened me. What did she say exactly? I recounted the conversation. Morrison was quiet for a moment. That's concerning, but not quite specific enough to be a credible threat, but I'll add it to the file. We're actually making progress on the investigation. We've identified 2 of the individuals involved in the vandalism. We should have arrests soon. Really? Yes, one of them is Mark Williams, the HOA compliance officer. I was stunned. The HOA board member, that's right. We have him on camera slashing your tires. Once we bring him in, I'm confident he'll give us information about the others. The arrests happened the following week. Mark Williams was charged with criminal mischief and vandalism. 2 other Pleasant Shores residents were also arrested for their roles in various incidents. But the real bombshell came when Mark, facing serious charges, agreed to cooperate with the investigation. He confirmed that Patricia had been coordinating the harassment campaign. She hadn't explicitly ordered anyone to vandalize my property, but she had made it clear in HOA board meetings that anyone who discouraged me from staying in Pleasant Shores would be doing the community a favor. She had created an atmosphere where attacking me was seen as defending the community. Morrison called me with the news. "We're going to arrest Patricia Whitmore tomorrow morning. She's being charged with conspiracy to commit harassment and criminal mischief. The prosecutor thinks we have enough to make the charges stick. This is really happening." "Yes. And Theodore, I want you to be careful. When people like Patricia feel cornered, they sometimes do desperate things. Don't be alone on that island for the next few days." I took her advice seriously. The next morning, I watched from my house as 2 police cars pulled up to Patricia's house, 3 doors down from mine. Patricia was led out in handcuffs, still in her bathrobe, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Neighbors came out to watch, whispering to each other in shock. The news spread through Pleasant Shores like wildfire. By that evening, the Facebook group Save Willow Island had been deleted, and several prominent HOA supporters had posted public apologies. The Detroit law firm representing the HOA withdrew from the case, citing ethical concerns now that their client's president had been arrested. The trial was still scheduled for December, but without Patricia leading the charge and with board members facing criminal charges, the HOA's will to fight seemed to collapse. Their new attorney, a local guy named Phil Brennan, called Gary 2 weeks before the trial date. "My clients want to settle," Brennan said. "What would it take?" Gary and I discussed it. "I want a complete acknowledgement that I own the island," I said. "I want all the fines and penalties erased. I want my legal fees paid, and I want a public apology." Gary relayed the terms. Brennan came back with a counter-offer. They'd acknowledge the ownership and pay half the legal fees, but they wouldn't do a public apology. "Not good enough," I said. "They destroyed my reputation in this community. They need to fix that." It took another week of negotiations, but eventually, we reached a settlement. The HOA would issue a formal statement acknowledging that Fitzgerald Island was my private property and had always been so. They would pay my legal fees in full, remove all fines and penalties, and issue a public apology to be published in the community newsletter and posted on the community website. The statement was published just before Christmas. The Pleasant Shores Homeowners Association acknowledges that the island commonly referred to as Willow Island is and has always been the private property of the Fitzgerald family. The HOA regrets the confusion and conflict that arose from a misunderstanding of the property's ownership status. We apologize to Theodore Fitzgerald for any inconvenience or distress caused by this matter. The HOA reaffirms its commitment to respecting the property rights of all residents. It was corporate and bland, but it was public. Everyone in Pleasant Shores now knew that the HOA had been wrong. Patricia's criminal case moved through the courts more slowly. Her lawyer tried to get the charges dismissed, arguing that she had only expressed opinions and hadn't directly ordered anyone to commit crimes. But the prosecutor had recordings from HOA meetings where Patricia had made statements like, "Someone needs to make him understand he's not welcome here. And if his property keeps getting damaged, maybe he'll leave." Combined with Mark Williams's testimony about the implied encouragement to harass me, it was enough. Patricia eventually pled guilty to a reduced charge of conspiracy to commit harassment. She got 6 months in jail, suspended to probation, and was required to pay restitution for the damage to my property. She also had to resign from the HOA board and was permanently barred from holding any HOA office in Michigan. The repairs to the cabin took most of the winter. I replaced the windows, fixed the damaged walls, replaced the furniture that had been destroyed. My father came back to help, and we spent several weekends working together, just like I had done with my grandfather when I was a kid. As we worked, my father told me stories about the island's history that I had never heard before. How my great-great-grandfather had harvested specific trees for ship masts, leaving others to grow. How my great-grandfather had built a small dock that had washed away in a storm in the 1920s. How my grandfather had proposed to my grandmother on the island's eastern shore, under an old willow tree that had since died and been replaced by oaks. "This island is more than just property," my father said as we sat on the cabin's porch, drinking coffee and watching the sun set over Lake Huron. "It's our family's connection to this place, to Michigan, to a way of life that's mostly gone now. Your great-great-grandfather came here with nothing, built a business, raised a family. This island was his refuge, his place to think and plan and dream. Every generation has added something to it." "And now it's my turn," I said. "And now it's your turn." The community's attitude toward me shifted gradually. Some people remained hostile, but most seemed embarrassed by the whole situation. Several neighbors came by to apologize personally, saying they had been caught up in the group mentality and hadn't thought critically about the HOA's claims. One woman, a retired teacher named Margaret who lived 2 streets over, brought me a pie and a handwritten note. "I'm sorry," the note said. "I should have questioned what we were being told. I'm glad you stood your ground." By spring, I had been living in Pleasant Shores for a full year. The island was restored better than before. I had reinforced the cabin's foundation, upgraded the roof, added solar panels for electricity. It was once again the peaceful retreat my grandfather had envisioned. The HOA had new leadership. Jennifer Morrison had resigned along with Patricia, and Sandra Chen had taken over as interim president. She ran unopposed in the spring election, along with a slate of new board members who seemed genuinely interested in managing the community rather than controlling everyone's lives. Sandra called me one evening in April. "Theodore, I want to apologize again for everything that happened." The board behaved inexcusably. "Water under the bridge," I said, though it wasn't quite true. The wounds were still there. "I also want to ask you something, and please feel free to say no. Would you be willing to give the community a tour of the island? Not to use it, just to visit. To understand its history and why it's important to your family. I think it might help heal some of the divisions." I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep the island completely private as a matter of principle. But another part of me understood what Sandra was really asking for, a chance at reconciliation. "One tour," I said. "Small group, invitation only, and everyone signs a waiver acknowledging it's private property." "Of course. Thank you, Theodore." The tour happened on a Saturday in May. I limited it to 15 people. Sandra and the new board members, Officer Morrison, who had helped me through the investigation, a few neighbors who had supported me, and Margaret, the retired teacher who had apologized. I showed them the cabin, explained its history, showed them copies of the 1892 deed and the old survey maps. I told them about my great-great-grandfather's shipbuilding business, about how each generation had cared for the island, about what it meant to my family. "This isn't just land," I said as we stood on the shore, looking back at the mainland. "It's 130 years of my family's history. It's the place my grandfather came to when my grandmother died to find peace. It's where my father learned to fish and to build things with his hands. It's where I'm learning to do the same. That's why I couldn't just give it up. Not because I'm selfish or greedy, but because some things are worth fighting for." There were nods around the group. Margaret was wiping her eyes. "Thank you for sharing this with us," Sandra said. "I think we understand now, and I'm sorry we didn't take the time to understand before." As everyone was leaving, Officer Morrison hung back. "You did good," she said, standing up to them. "A lot of people would have just given in. I got lucky. If my father hadn't kept those old documents, I might have lost. Maybe. But you also didn't back down when things got ugly. That takes courage." After everyone left, I sat on the cabin's porch alone, watching the afternoon light play across the water. The island was quiet except for the sound of waves and birds. It was peaceful in a way it hadn't been for a year. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "How'd the tour go?" "Good," I typed back. "I think we're going to be okay. Proud of you, son. Grandpa would be too." I sat there until sunset, thinking about my great-great-grandfather purchasing this island in 1892 for $75. Thinking about everything the island had been through, all the history it held, all the fights it had survived. A small island in Lake Huron didn't seem like much to most people, but to the Fitzgerald family, it was everything. It was proof that some things endure, that family and history and standing up for what's right still matter. Patricia Whitmore and the HOA had tried to take that away, tried to erase 130 years of ownership with nothing but entitlement and aggression, but they had failed. The 1892 deed had proven what I already knew. This island belonged to my family. It always had, and it always would. The next morning, I went back to the mainland and started my day like any other. I waved to neighbors, who now waved back. I checked my mail without finding violation notices. I went to work, came home, had dinner, lived my life. But that evening I took my boat out to the island again. I stood on the shore where my great-great-grandfather had probably stood 134 years ago, looking at the trees he had harvested and the ones he had left to grow. I thought about all the Fitzgeralds who had come after him, each one adding their own chapter to the island's story. Now it was my turn to write the next chapter. And thanks to a yellowed piece of paper from 1892, thanks to standing my ground against people who thought they could bully me into submission, I had that chance. The island was mine. More importantly, it was my family's. And no HOA, no matter how aggressive or entitled, could ever change that fact. I walked up to the cabin, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The smell of fresh wood and paint still lingered from the repairs. I had added a few touches of my own. New shelving, better insulation, a small wood stove for cool evenings. The cabin was better than it had been, ready for another generation of Fitzgeralds. Someday, I'd bring my own kids here if I was lucky enough to have them. I'd teach them to fish off the dock, to identify birds by their calls, to respect the land and the water. I'd tell them about their great-great-great-grandfather who bought this island with $75 and a dream. I'd tell them about the fight to keep it, about standing up to bullies, about the importance of knowing your rights and defending them. And I'd show them the deed from 1892, carefully preserved in its frame, hanging on the cabin wall where it belonged. Physical proof that some things are worth fighting for, and that the truth, no matter how old, is still the truth. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in brilliant colors. I sat on the porch with a beer, my feet propped up on the railing, and felt something I hadn't felt in a year, completely at peace. Pleasant Shores would never be my favorite place. Too many bad memories, too much conflict. But I could live there now without constant stress, without looking over my shoulder, without dreading what new harassment the HOA would dream up. Patricia was gone, facing the consequences of her actions. The people who had vandalized my property had been held accountable. The HOA had been forced to acknowledge reality. And most importantly, my island was secure, legally and officially recognized as what it had always been, Fitzgerald property. I raised my beer in a silent toast to my great-great-grandfather James, to my great-grandfather and grandfather, to my father, and to all the Fitzgeralds yet to come. We had held onto this small piece of Michigan through wars and depressions, through storms and changes, through 134 years of history. And we'd hold on to it for 134 more. The fight with the Pleasant Shores HOA had cost me time, money, and peace of mind. But it had also taught me something important, that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when everyone is against you, is worth it. That family and history matter. That bullies, no matter how organized or confident, can be defeated if you refuse to back down. As darkness fell over Lake Huron and the stars began to appear, I felt a connection to this place that went deeper than ownership. This island was part of me, part of my family's story, part of something larger than any one person. Patricia Whitmore had said my old piece of paper didn't matter. But she had been wrong. That old piece of paper, that deed from 1892, had mattered more than anything else. It had been the truth that couldn't be argued away, the proof that couldn't be denied, the foundation on which everything else stood. In the end, the law had worked the way it was supposed to. Property rights had been respected. Justice had been served. The bad guys had lost, and the good guy, for once, had won. I finished my beer and locked up the cabin. As I walked down to my boat, I looked back one more time at the island silhouetted against the darkening sky. It looked the same as it probably had in 1892, unchanged by time, constant in a changing world. That constancy was comforting. No matter what happened in my life, no matter what challenges came, this island would be here, waiting, enduring, a small piece of permanence in an impermanent world. I climbed into my boat and started the engine, heading back toward the lights of Pleasant Shores. Behind me, the island disappeared into the darkness. But I knew it was there. I knew it would always be there. And I knew that the next time someone tried to claim what wasn't theirs, I'd be ready. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all. Know your rights, stand your ground, and never underestimate the power of an old deed from 1892. The story of the HOA Karren who thought my private island belonged to everyone had ended the only way it could. With the truth winning out over entitlement, with justice prevailing over bullying, and with the Fitzgerald family still owning the island that had been ours for more than a century. Some stories have happy endings. This was one of them. And as I tied up my boat at the dock and walked toward my house on the mainland, I smiled, knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, things work out exactly as they should.